the show needs to be what it needs to be, right? So a 3 hour long interview can be really, really good, but it depends on the interviewer and the sort of substance of the interviewee. And it takes one kind of talent to be able to hold a full 3 hours.
Podcast Junkies, episode 231. I'm back. I'm Harry Duran. I'm the host of this show, the one where we talk to the best, most amazing podcasters in the podosphere. Okay, podcast personalities, anyone doing awesome things with their shows. Kind of like last week when we had Scott Miller on. Scott is an EVP at Franklin Covey. And I would imagine many of you have heard of the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Super, super classic, Stephen Covey. And we actually referenced Stephen in my conversation with Scott, and he actually got to meet him. And so that was pretty cool. And as someone who grew up in the corporate world, it was interesting to have that conversation with Scott. This week, I get to speak to the one and only Nick Quah. He is the creator of Hot Pod News and the host of Servant of the Pod, one of his newest creations. I was super excited to have this conversation with Nick. He is well known in the podosphere. His Hot Pot News is widely read by folks in the podcasting industry. As an immigrant to the United States, Nick has a unique perspective on the things that are happening in this country. And we touch on topics ranging from the pandemic to the current climate of racial unrest. Never one to shy away from challenging subjects, Nick shares his thoughts on the need for open discussion on topics typically considered taboo, such as anxiety and depression. We get the origin story of the Hot Pod newsletter and Nick's thoughts on paid newsletters and the current state of media. I asked him to share the inspiration for starting the Servant of the Pod podcast and what he's learned in his short time as a podcast host. It was definitely one of those conversations when two podcast nerds get to talking that I felt could have gone on an extra hour or so. This episode's brought to you by Focusrite, specifically the Scarlett 2i2, my go-to sound card for all things related to great sound, which is something I really take pride in, and I'm grateful for my partnership with the Focusrite team over these past few years. Special thanks to a review from Stephanie Fuccio. Stephanie writes, I am late to this incredible podcast because until recently, I was a maniac running around all crazy, tasked out like an idiot to appreciate the genuineness that Harry exudes with his guests. His genuine, approachable, and naturally paced conversations on this podcast are soothing to the soul. Don't be like me and miss out on this experience that is damn near podcast meditation. Oh, that's so sweet. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Don't forget, you too can leave a rating and review that will get read out on this very same podcast. Head on over to ratethispodcast.com/podcast junkies. This episode is also brought to you by Fullcast. If you're looking for help as a business with your podcast, we offer done-for-you services, coaching and consulting with our done-with-you services. And now we also have the Ultimate Podcast Dojo available. It's a new course and community designed to help you start your own podcast. Additional details at fullcast.co/dojo, D-O-J-O. Stay tuned to the end of the episode where I reveal this week's retention hashtag. But for now, let's get into this great conversation with Nick. Nick Quah, founder of Hot Pod newsletter and host of Servant of Pod. Welcome to Podcast Junkies.
Hey, it's my pleasure.
I was wondering what dish you missed the most from your home country, Malaysia.
It's good opening question. The one that I think about the most is something called bak kut teh, which is like kind of herbal pork stew situation. I remember having it almost every Friday night growing up. But, you can't really get that here because it's pretty intense.
Yeah. And so you moved here in 2008. Is that right?
Yes, I did. I moved here first to Connecticut for college and then stuck around ever since.
And how long were you thinking about the United States before you actually made the move?
Actually, not very long. There is a parallel alternate universe in which I would have ended up the UK. I was actually supposed to study law in England, but then there was this scholarship opportunity at a university I ended up going to for college, and I applied for that on a whim. And about 2 months later, it turns out that I had the opportunity to come over, and then I, for some reason, made the decision to do it.
What was the biggest shock for you? I've spoken to people that have grown up most of their lives in another country, having watched Baywatch, and then they come here and they're very disappointed when they hit the shores here. So I'm wondering if there was anything that jumped out at you, like culture-wise, that was a bit jarring for you.
I think I'm wired in such a way that I don't really get much of culture shock. Sort of intuitively understand that things are going to be sort of different wherever I go to, even if it's my home country. So I don't know. I didn't really have that much of a trouble. The trouble really came from just like trying to figure out like what I wanted to be and all that kind of stuff.
Have you answered that question yet?
No, I don't think I ever will. I do know that, however, I tend to get lazy between the hours of 4 and 7. That's the extent to which I achieve self-knowledge.
Oh, really? What are you reading or that's of interest to you that's not podcasting related?
Actually, make it a point to consume a lot of stuff that isn't necessarily media podcast related. Right now, I just finished a book called Pew by Catherine Lacey.
Okay.
Incredibly good book. Sort of pitches a fable with a moral. I think it's the way that somebody phrased it to me. I don't know. I'm about to start cracking into How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. Wrote about psychedelics. Yeah. I find that topic interesting. I'm very envious about the way he writes, and so that's, I think, the next thing I'm sort of crawling into right now.
How much of your writing style in the newsletter is inspired by the books that you read?
Less than you would think. I'm actually I was really formed by the sort of heyday of the blogging era, just reading people, being very voicey and finding their perspective online. The All was really big. Gawker was really big for me. Bill Simmons, who's the sort of famed columnist now over at The Ringer, was kind of really formative for me.
Yeah.
But I think as I've, done this for a couple of years now, and I publish relentlessly, and so I'm trying to read more fiction, more literature, just to get a little bit more of an elegance to the way I write. I think I'm at a very beginning stages of that process, but yeah, it's none of this is conscious. I write the way that I think my brain works. That's kind of how it functions.
And you're also a student of philosophy.
To an extent, yeah. That was one of the things I focused on in college. It's one of the things that I think about a lot, and it was an area in podcasting I consumed a lot of. Less so nowadays, because I think I kind of just max out about other people's opinions about philosophy. Philosophy in the sort of traditional academic sense. I think there's philosophy in almost everything else in our lives. So that's a little bit of a separate question.
I heard you on the Substack podcast. It was a couple years ago now, and you were talking about this book that I just discovered recently, Finite Games versus Infinite Games. And so it's been something that's top of mind, this idea of personal sovereignty, sense-making, meaning-making. So it's taken me down a couple of rabbit holes, and I've discovered folks like Jordan Hall, Daniel Schmachtenberger, Jamie Wheel, one of the co-founders of Flow Genome Project. So I'm just wondering if you've found yourself drifting back towards something like that in this, given the world we're living in, where a lot of stuff right now seems like it's not making sense.
No, I mean, it's interesting to phrase it that way, and that the expectation that in this moment I would gravitate towards philosophy. No, I think my experience has been the opposite direction. I feel like I have a tendency towards, in chaotic and particularly dark times, to really, really lean into the dark. So none of this has forced me to like on the bigger questions of like life or whatever, but it's really sort of hooked my brain on like very tangible experiences and solutions. So, really thinking through what the pandemic means for my community, for the place that I live in, it sort of really activated me politically in ways that I did not expect. And yeah, I don't know. I think to some extent, yes, I suppose I have been reading a certain form of philosophy mostly, but it's mostly been around organizing and political activism, less so the questions about, a person's place in the universe or something like that.
So as of this recording, we're towards the end of July 2020, just to put a timestamp in there for future listeners.
Yeah, here's a time capsule, when you dig it out for the ground. Yeah.
Can you summarize what your experience has been with, everything that's happened, mainly focused on COVID and then the racial unrest, and just what impact, if any, it's had to you and the business?
Yeah, so, I think first and foremost on the business component, because I think it's the sort of the uniting factor for me being on this show, it's been surprisingly stable. Like I had really sort of buckled down for some form of breakdown, some form of meltdown, like whether it is, like a loss in contract or a loss in corporate subscription or something like that. That has not turned out to be the case. There were a couple of lost accounts, but that's about it. And for the most part, it's been really stable. And, the question is like, is this 6 months, 12 months, 16 months? So all of that is intact. However, whenever there's a moment of tremendous change and anxiety, there's a story to chase. And so from a story and journalistic and editorial creative perspective, that has not been sort of a diminishing issue. But for me personally, it's sort of being at home a lot and because I work on the internet and work on my laptop, the distance between me and work has shrunk dramatically. And so
Yeah.
really sort of holding on to the ethos of like my life is more than the sum of my work has been sort of really important to me at this point. And so the past couple of weeks, watching the George Floyd protests sort of bubble up, finding ways to participate safely here in where I live in Boise, Idaho, has been sort of top of mind. And a lot of it is sort of like also kind of tempered through the fact that I'm an immigrant here. Like I'm not naturalized as an American citizen, and also I'm of a sort of an ethnic minority that's somewhat adjacent to, but not really directly in to these conversations that we're having right now about race relations in America, which is primarily black and white. So that's been that's been like a very condensed version of all the stuff that we're sort of processing the past couple of weeks. All the while trying to sort of find ways to bring that into the work, keep it separate, keep it some of it for myself. Yeah, I don't know. It's again, one thing that I will never sort of come up to is that I do not have a ton of self-knowledge yet, and so this has been a big step towards that process.
How much did you have to educate yourself, or did you already know about the history of systemic racism in this country?
I'm actually very, very familiar with it. Also, just being being I'm not black, but I am an immigrant. And so the safeties and the assumptions in one's life, if one were white in America, are not the same, obviously,
Yeah.
And also, it was a big part of my just formal education in college, is just sort of highlighting a lot of these components and these understandings about America, and also the ways in which it is similar to other countries like my own, and other countries that have their own social, political, racial inequities. So no, I wasn't terribly surprised. I also am a minority in my home country. And so like that's it's par for the course,
Yeah. So when you arrived from Malaysia, you went to Chicago and you were there till about 2012, is that right?
No, actually, I was in Connecticut from 2008 to 2012,
okay.
and I went to Chicago for graduate school in 2012, 2013.
Yeah, I think one of the things I remember hearing from that interview on Substack is you were basically wandering the city listening to random shit.
Yeah,
as you
yeah.
put it.
That was a really sort of interesting part of my life. I had thought that I wanted to go into academia, get a degree in sociology and in urban sociology specifically. And, a couple of weeks into my graduate program, I just realized that this is not life for me. I wanted sort of something else. But of course, like being not an American, my visa is tethered to my factors of being a student. So a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety. It was at that time sort of I really started consuming podcasts a lot. Started consuming all sorts of different kinds of art a lot. But podcasting, I think podcasts at that time kind of really met the moment for me as to what I needed. And so, yeah, walking around Chicago, fucking dead of winter, listening to stuff so that I don't have to like deal with my problems in my apartment. That was a really formative moment in my life.
Yeah, you mentioned WTF was
a big one, really big one. Because very similar themes pop up in at least that point of his work. He processed a lot of, anxiety, depression, jealousy, that kind of stuff. And, he's also a dude. I'm a dude. Like there's this like, it's a very male kind of processing.
Internal.
Internal, angry, entitled, privileged. And so like that, it was an interesting sort of emotional platform to do so. But that was also the era that I kind of basically listened to every This American Life episode from the beginning that I could find.
Okay.
Yeah, same deal with Radiolab. I was listening at the time to a lot of philosophy podcasts as well, particularly one called Partially Examined Life, which holds a kind of a deep place, sort of dear place in my heart. But yeah, that was a really interesting time.
It seems like you mentioned this idea of having anxiety, and then you also had John Moe on as one of your early guests, The Hilarious World of Depression, great title. And what's interesting is that he had already the show discontinued by the time you had him on. Is there a thread there, a common thread, just kind of having it's a topic that like not a lot of people like to talk about, and I've struggled through anxiety myself, and I think I'm wondering what your thoughts are on having or hearing more people speak about it so it's not such a taboo subject.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely, particularly in the past couple of years, it has felt like that discourse has really opened up, and that I think more people are, willing to talk about it and integrate it into sort of their public lives. However, I think it's also really limited to media spaces. There's a lot of people who write about it. There's a lot of ways in which that makes it into television or movies or something like that, or just celebrity in general. But I'm pretty sure that in spaces that aren't, media, many workplaces, many communities, that is still very much probably a very difficult thing to talk about with people that people should be talking to, like their loved ones and their support system. So it's one thing to perform the act of processing one's anxiety, like in public. It's another to really like bring it into the home and talk to your mom and dad about like what that actually means to your life, that kind of thing.
Is it? I don't know if it's the same for you. I was born in El Salvador, so there's a cultural stigma. I think that you don't talk about these topics, or you don't air these topics, or
Yeah, yeah. No, yeah, I mean, it's something I still can't really talk to my parents about, because, your parents, like, they just kind of want their kids to be okay.
yeah, of
And there
course.
wasn't that sort of culture, at least where I come from, about talk therapy or anxiety management or anything like that. Yeah, and so, you kind of want to connect with your parents on that level, but they don't really have the tools to do that. And like giving them the tools is also really hard. And so, no, so you find solace elsewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how do you explain what it is you do when you have conversations with family?
Actually, it's gotten easier past couple of years because I feel like I've had some amount of modest success up until this point, very, very loosely defined.
Yeah.
And so my parents just sort of have an understanding that I run a company, a very, very small company, but a company nonetheless, and that I have tangible products that they can sort of access and go like, oh, so that's what you do. So the podcast, like, launching Servant the Pod was, I think, a moment that made them better understand like what I do.
Yeah, legitimize you. You're actually quote unquote on the air.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think when I started contributing to Vulture, even though New York Magazine is not exactly a publication that's consumed a lot in Malaysia, they were like, "You have a job at a magazine." Like, and yeah, and it's also like they know I'm doing fine. We depend on each other just socially a lot anyway, so they sort of can tell that I'm in a okay place professionally.
So after Chicago, you finagled your way into a position at Business Insider.
Yeah, with a couple of detours along the way. After Chicago, I moved to New York for a number of different reasons, many of them arbitrary and stupid. And I, got a series of gigs, was working here and there at this sort of weird temp job at that startup and this whatever. And a lot of it was just bad, bad, bad experience up and down. With some exceptions, there were some really good teams that I got to be a part of and learn from. But at some point, that's when I started sort of thinking about freelance writing as a way to make additional money because I just wasn't getting paid enough. And it was around, maybe my third or fourth contribution. I was like, yeah, I think I want to try to get a job in a newsroom somewhere. And I just got really lucky, even though I didn't really end up working in a newsroom. I worked at Business Insider at the time. They had a product called BI Intelligence. I think now it's being sort of bundled together, eMarketer. And so like that's the kind of work that I was doing, writing sort of newsletter research reports about e-commerce for the most part. And yeah, I don't know. It was a good experience, I suppose, but it was a job.
Yeah, I'm wondering. You're making the rounds on the podcast now, obviously with the added visibility of Servant of Pod. So I'm wondering what it feels like. I imagine you're doing a lot more revisiting of those early days on some of these conversations.
Yeah, to some extent, I think folks do ask like, "What was that like?" This, and that, but like, I don't really think about it a lot because I think I'm of the sort of disposition where I always try to overload myself with work because that's kind of what gets my juices.
Yeah.
So like, I'm relentlessly looking forward and trying not to look backward as much as I can, which is again very unhealthy in a lot of ways. But I've yet to have time to process all of that.
Out of curiosity, you mentioned you took a lot of odd jobs through Craigslist. Through Craigslist, I'm wondering what the strangest job you ever took was.
It wasn't the strangest, but this one is like the strangest for me. I was in like phone sales. Like I would like cold call people and try to sell them on a service.
Yeah.
And it was such a shitty job, man. Like there are some people that you just call up and you kind of go like, you probably want to save that money, but it's my job to get you to spend that money. Man, it's just like, shit. And so
Yeah.
that's kind of how I could tell that I'm not going to be a good salesperson.
It's interesting about phone sales because the people that do it well seem to have an uncanny ability to manage either, I don't know if it's NLP or whatever it is they use, but they manage to, without sight unseen, have a conversation with someone in a way that could set them at ease and, over the course of the next couple of minutes, convince them to send them money, which I think is
Yeah, I
fascinating.
mean, it's not my kind of interacting with people. That's a very
Yeah.
extractive sort of. I'm like putting you at ease so I can get something from you. That's the kind of not how I work, even though I'm supposed to be a journalist. But yeah, no, it was a brutal job. It's such a it makes sense to me from that experience why a lot of the sort of chief sales officers that I've met through the years, they all have the same kind of personality. And from that experience, I kind of go like, oh yeah, that's probably why.
Yeah, no surprise there. So you're in New York, and then 2014 comes around, aka the year of cereal, and that was really the moment when you started the newsletter as well, right?
Yeah, I think consistent with the general narrative that like late 2014, that sort of first arc of the first season of Serial kind of had this sort of moment where it drew a lot of attention to where something that already existed was there, it was growing. You could use whatever term you want, supercharged, da 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 da. At the time, I was at Business Insider, and I very acutely remember watching that show just like come into the consciousness and seeing people kind of start asking the question in media outlets and just in private conversation, like, what the hell's a podcast? And then seeing people try to explain it who, aren't actually consumers or aren't really super familiar with what that world is. And by that time, I had been consuming podcasts for a number of years and was already a significant sort of consumer fan. And so I started a newsletter largely because like I was really frustrated what I saw in terms of the coverage of just like kind of treating it somewhat condescendingly when I really wanted to it started out as being like 50%, recommendations, 50%. This is a news thing, and this is how I process this, and this is what I think the business is. So that was the initial like spark of Hot Pod.
Yeah, I remember the early days. I started my podcast actually 2014 as well. So it's been interesting because I thought at the time I was late.
Yeah, I hear that a lot.
I
hear
the
that a lot. Like people starting around that era, like, did we miss the boat? And then it's funny, like a lot of those people now are, quite wealthy or have now big jobs somewhere.
Yeah.
And I'm beginning to hear the same thing again. I think early 2019 was start hearing the same thing. Was like, oh, am I too late? And I'm like, no. So what do you mean by late? We just got started, Fred. Like, what's going on?
Yeah, that's a lot interesting. So thoughts on the New York Times acquisition?
It makes sense. It really, I think the way to understand that company now is they're really fiercely committed to preserving a certain sort of feeling of a brand, prestige sort of like stature within a certain layer of publishing. The core business model remains this push towards subscriptions, but audio and audio advertising has been a real growing revenue sector for them. And it's also like audio has been such a great marketing funnel for them, specifically with the Daily and also the other sort of stuff like Caliphate and Rabbit Hole. So the addition of Serial Productions, adds to that sort of core. We are like the powerhouse of this kind of audio journalism, audio storytelling. That's only going to be good for certain forms of advertisers who want to advertise with them. But that's also going to be really good for people who will probably become Time subscribers if they aren't already moving forward.
Yeah.
But the more important thing to look at is like, not more important, but the thing that I think it's a little bit underplayed is the This American Life relationship, where they will be taking over ad sales for that, and just building a co-partnership between those two brands. So that's so smart. That's really interesting, because where else was Serial Productions and This American Life going to go?
Yeah. How much time now are you spending on a newsletter, and can you talk a little bit about building up the team? And something that I thought was interesting in the Substack one, this may have changed, but you said that you actually don't see yourself as a journalist.
Yeah, no, I don't. I still don't. I remember also saying that on Long Form, which is that podcast with actual journalists. Max Linsky, who was interviewing me, then pressed me on the point. I still don't sort of kind of identify myself in that tribe at large. I mean, I participate in the act of it, but I'm interested in doing other forms of writing as well, and I'm very, very cognizant about labels. And so yeah, it's funny because like I'm writing this newsletter now. I'm a critic for Vulture New York Magazine. I'm doing this podcast as well. I work on a number of other kinds of projects that are unrelated to podcasts whatsoever. And like, I don't know. It's just I don't affiliate myself with any one profession at this point, other than a person who runs a small business and says shit. And so no, I think. What was your earlier question? Like you had a question earlier on.
Yeah, I was just thinking. Can you talk a little bit about how you've grown? Because I mean, when you going from working somewhere to starting something as a solo project to then beginning to like need to hire someone to have like an actual company where you have people that now you're responsible for in terms of like keeping them employed. So I'm wondering what the growth has looked like and what that journey's been like for you.
Yeah, so I think the clarification that's needed here is that like Hotpot isn't a company yet. Like, I mean, it's and I don't think I have any interest in getting to that point. So Caroline Crampton, who's based in the UK, and she's, probably the only super regular contributor, in many ways sort of my editorial partner. She gets paid more than I do from the business. But it's like, I built Hotpot as a vessel, two kinds of things. One is that I really, really want a space to have the kinds of conversations about podcasting and kind of news analysis and just sort of like commentary and journalism that I wanted to do. And the other thing is that I just, it's a home. Like it's not really a company that employs people. If people want to write for me, they can pitch that kind of thing. But my sort of responsibility is to make sure that the sort of revenue keeps coming in, that the audiences get served reliably week over week. Caroline is on a contract. She's the only person that's contributed that has a contract. Everybody else is pretty informal. And that's the way that I like to keep it, because I think I like to keep these things flexible.
What's your thoughts about this current resurgence or wave of these paid newsletters like the Substacks? It seems like a lot of folks, Barry Weiss left the New York Times, and I think doing a paid newsletter as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of ways to attack that question. And I think from one perspective, to begin with, like the paid newsletter life is not for everybody, I think if you have certain expectations about the prestige that you have in your life and being in an institution that can support you in a bunch of different ways, including not having to worry about payroll or human resources or troubleshooting even, this life is not for everybody. It's really hard, and you don't get the same form of dignity and respect that you would be afforded to if you were just a sort of worker somewhere. So I think that's like on the base level something that's I think that's really interesting. But I'm very pro this push for people to take control of their publishing infrastructure. However, I am very sort of skeptical of this conversation about this being the quote unquote future of media, journalism. Where this is sort of the trend where everybody's going. Everybody's going to be an independent, discrete writer.
Yeah.
First of all, it's just a very difficult market proposition, right?
Slog.
Like it's the same thing with the streaming services. You have only so many dollars to give. And if you're in a situation where you're thinking, well, if everybody has one of these things and we're basically micro-targeting and carving up smaller and smaller pies of the overall readership, you have a bit of a sort of a market sizing problem, but you also have something of a sort of impact problem where only, an X number of people read you, where you could have had greater impact if you were bundled up even. And so like my gut feeling is that, this is not going to work out for everybody, but there will be a push for a rebundling. And I suspect that that's what platform like Substack is anticipating that they will be able to get a cut of, is that if that rebundling happens again, and then they end up being sort of the underlying guts of that publishing infrastructure. However, I don't know. That's sort of from my perspective. I think I'm trying to sort of approach this with an open mind in the same way that a bunch of people were already podcasting when all these everybody said it wanted to make a podcast. I'm cognizant that I think there are some aspects of this argument that maybe I'm not aware of.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the bundling. There's that actually happening already. Substack, everything is a sort of bundling of like 5 or 6 different newsletters, all about productivity and organization. So I think, basically you pay the one price, I think it's 20 as opposed to paying 10 for each one. And there's, I think 5 of them on now. So I think they are, to your point, looking at that as a way to get in front of more people and introduce them to a wider variety of writers.
Absolutely. And it's like, I think it's listed at the number one paid Substack on that chart is actually a group of writers already. So, that in itself is a bundle, right? And so in a way, like, I think any discourse advanced forward by opinion pages and op-ed pages is like inherently kind of dumb or simplistic, And so like, I feel like this is such a simplistic, no offense to op-ed writers and opinion writers, but it's like, it's super simple. Like it's not going to be just this way. We're finding our way through the dialectic here, and we'll come out to the other end with a little bit of both and something that hopefully advances the structure forward.
You mentioned on Digiday that you'd be happy if someone put you out of your misery.
Yes, I did.
Is that really just kind of, if there was an opportunity to sell HotPod and some other projects up your sleeve that you want to put some time into?
I mean, this is mostly just an expression of like, this shit is really hard. But I'm also just an incredibly stubborn person. And I really, really prize my independence. I really, really prize my freedom. Particularly as a person who doesn't inherently have a ton of like structural power in American society. I have like, I'm an immigrant, I'm not white, I live in Idaho. So like naturally I do not have the same like levels of opportunities that people would be willing to give me versus have to go make that for myself. But yeah, the price of independence is that that everything hurts all the time and my head is spinning. And so some days, like the day that I went on Digiday, felt like I just wanted to just jump off a cliff. That's just kind of how it is.
They find you at that moment in time. How'd you end up in Boise?
My wife's from here. and we just made a decision to come back.
Okay. Was that another culture shock for you?
To an extent, you know, I'm a decently open-minded person, and so like all things considered, I didn't really have a culture shock. I'm very cognizant of like the specificities of Idaho and what being a non-white person is in Idaho. And so like I'm not coming in with any illusions here. There will be racism, there will be racism.
Yeah.
But it's not any different from when I lived in Connecticut or New York or Chicago.
Yeah, I grew up just outside New York City, Yonkers, New York. So, and I've lived in New York City, Brooklyn, and New York. And then in 2014 moved to LA. So I lived there for 4 years, and now I'm in Minneapolis. So like did both coasts, and then obviously with everything that's been happening.
Yeah. How long you been in Minneapolis?
For a year.
I mean, before the pandemic and that's like my understanding is that Minneapolis is actually like, you know, I would dare say cooler Chicago.
Yeah.
No, people are gonna beat the shit out of me if I say that. Do you like it being there?
It took some getting used to. It's cold as hell here. I mean, minus 20 is no joke. Even having gone to school in upstate New York and living in New York, there's something about.
Wait, you said minus 20 degrees Celsius?
No, Fahrenheit. Yeah. So I had to buy a new winter coat. Just
Jesus. What brought you to Minneapolis?
My girlfriend's here now.
That's how these things roll for us.
You can relate. Well, they do. I mean, I don't know how cold it gets there, but I mean, we walk on lakes, and it's like I'm always just like, how thick is this? And like, how is it safe? And they drive on them too, so it's even wilder. So
I know to like the area that I'm in, it's a high desert, so we get like dry heat.
Okay.
And so we're in the thick of it right now.
Okay. Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah, I think it's just another perspective. And obviously, when the George Floyd stuff hit, the looting was literally happening in one of our neighborhoods. Like, we share an alley with the Apple store, and there was people like running by my window with like iMacs in their hands. It was kind of nuts. Yeah, we'll see where we end up on the other side of this. It's definitely a historic moment in time, and I tell my girlfriend all the time it'd be interesting in 2030 to be looking back at like, can you believe that?
Well, hopefully it's a different kind of can you believe that, and more like can you believe how like fucked up like police systems are. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. No, it's just interesting, and with so much happening, it's hard not to have an opinion about what's happening, either socially and politically. And I'm curious. You did mention this idea of being political. Is that something you're conscious of in terms of your writing, to not be too polarizing and try to find a balance in there that is not shows you specifically having any specific favoritism?
No, I think I get fairly transparent. Like I've been politically active for much of my life when I was in Malaysia, and less so when I moved to the States because, not my country. So let's see what's up. But no, with Hot Pot specifically, I don't hide it to an extent. But I am very much my parents' son in the sense that like I try to be polite about it. I try to, and maybe that's, there are sort of lines of argumentation. That kind of politeness is actually deleterious to advancing certain ideas or shifting the Overton window or whatever. But like I think it's pretty clear if people read me, they kind of know that like I don't give two shits about like fucking the conservative legislature in the Senate or Congress or dare I say my own state. And it's like I don't see the point of hiding it because a lot of these policies actively are hurtful to me personally as a person moving to this world. And so like why should I defend that or not be alive to that? And so no, but the thing about Hot Pot is that like I try to really focus it on like the story of podcasting specifically, of business specifically. I think over the past 5 years, it's very clearly been a story about capitalism, and there are different political ways that you can approach that. But I think people have a general sensibility where I sit in the spectrum here, and I'm not super progressive on some things, but I am very much so on others. And I think, just opening yourself up to that complexity and nuances is important without outright saying or giving yourself a label, And so that's been sort of my political experience through the publication.
How did you meet your girlfriend?
My wife actually went to college.
Wife now, yeah. On college, okay. Is she in the business as well? Or?
No. God, no. Okay. Thank goodness. She's not in media. She's,
okay.
Thank God.
Yeah. So shifting gears to the podcast, obviously, writing a newsletter about podcasting, I think you probably figured it was about time to actually get behind the mic. So I'm wondering what the initial inspiration was for starting it and how long you waited before recording that first episode.
Actually, there wasn't So, I got emails at the time for a couple of years, like, why don't you make a hot podcast, a hot pot podcast? And I'm like, well, why don't you make a hot pot podcast? And it's a lot of it was just work. Last year, fall, sort of a project, longer term project I was working on, this didn't really pan out. I sort of had this creative hole in my life. I was like, all right, a lot of the time that I've ordinarily spent working on this project, I want something to fill this in. And I don't really want it to be sort of a direct extension of the stuff that I'm already doing. But also, like, I'm also interested in like what the experience is of building a show, of partnering with an institution, and see what that process is, because I write about it all the time. It would be interesting if I went through that process and and tried to really take it seriously and just grow my empathy there. And so that's sort of when I started thinking about, like, let's build a show, but also let's specifically build it with an organization. And I reached out to KPCC LA Studios, largely because I knew that they had a team in place and that they were interested in doing more stuff in podcasting. And I was just like, I was closer to, I had moved to Boise by that time, and I was like, well, that's closer to LA, and I don't really want to partner with anybody in New York at this point because I don't want to fly back and forth to New York. And so I reached out to pitch, and then very quickly moved to the stages and started working on the show. And so essentially, creatively speaking, I just wanted a space to build a bunch of different profiles, and working with a team that has specialized in podcasting for a while now has been such a really interesting experience.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because you mentioned on the Digiday episode that you missed working with teams. So are you getting some of that now in your work with LAist?
Absolutely, absolutely. Working with teams also means in many ways that working with other people's needs and expectations. And that's something that I've never had to do with Hotpot, because like it's what I say goes. And like anybody who's sort of written for me, and Caroline I think can tell you this, is sort of like I don't really want to control what she writes or what anybody writes. I'm interested to just work with them and like just publish it. It's for me. It's either if it's not a good fit, I'll say it's not a good fit, and we're not gonna move forward with that. But with working on the show, it's like it's been interesting because I would have an idea, but it wouldn't be interesting to the producer. Okay, so how can we find a way that's interesting to the producer? They do things a certain way, which runs into counter sometimes with certain artistic ideas that I have. But I kind of want to learn from this, so I see the floor and all right, let's do your process. Let's see what you like to do, and then I'll just find my place in it. And so it's been a really interesting back and forth, and I think it's really helped me grow from that perspective. Whether it'll be a successful show is something that we're still actively, aggressively working on. But I think from a creative perspective, I'm quite happy with the process so far.
You find that you're getting your sea legs now? You had an early conversation with Anna Sales, and you were saying how nervous you were about creating the podcast and getting some feedback from her, because she's obviously that's a great show. And I'm wondering what you've been learning and comfortable you've been getting.
I'm still very much uncomfortable with all of it. I think to a large extent because I have been listening to podcasts for so much, and I know what I like, from as a consumer. And the problem is that as a consumer is one thing, but as a creator, getting to a point where you can make stuff that you yourself can are happy with as a consumer, that is, I think, an extremely hard thing, particularly if you myself and you've just like seen a lot and heard a lot and you have certain expectations. So I think there's still a massive gap between where I like to be creatively in terms of the product and where I would like it to be. But people have spent their entire lives getting good at one thing, and so I just have to sort of take that humility with me instead of like going, I should be fucking great at this by now. And so it's interesting, yeah. And also rubbing up against, sort of like the revenue expectations,
yeah.
And there's just sort of business expectations with the partners. And so, having that being another element of it kind of really dictates, my agency in a lot of ways of like, how do I want to approach this creatively? Well, I got to make sure that like it's something that can sit within their rubric and stuff like that. And so it's been interesting.
So given that several of the shows are interview based, who do you continue to admire in the space and that you draw inspiration from?
From an interviews perspective?
Interview based shows.
Interview based shows, it's you have your staples. You have your Terry Grosses, your Anna Sales,
Yeah.
But I've always found people like Howard Stern really interesting. I've always found people like, I don't know, I've also just found like conversational podcasts to be so much more interesting to me right now as opposed to interview podcasts.
That's interesting distinction.
I do make that distinction, yeah. And I realize that not everybody does, but like interviews sort of is like this, right? You're asking me questions. As an interviewer, your job is to not just like extract information from me, but also contextualize it and reconstruct it in a way that feels like a narrative. Conversational podcast is just, it's a discussion, and it's a good discussion is one thing to be had. A good discussion that's good to be had, to be heard, is a whole different thing. And that to me is like super interesting. And it's also really hard to do. It's also really hard to talk about and write about, which is something that I've been sort of really struggling with. All this is a lead up to say that I've been listening to a lot of this show called You're Wrong About. And it's this really fascinating discussion show that works through sort of an event, whether it's a true crime story or whether it's just a moment in history or a person or an icon that is widely understood to be one thing, but actually has a lot of this context around it. And it's one thing to construct that story through kind of like a true crime narrative, because it's so, to me, that's such a boring format now. It's so performative.
Oh yeah.
But to have people who are like really emotionally invested in like, this is what really happened in this thing, and I'm really interested in these components about it, and let's just talk it out. I think it's such a powerful thing.
Do you feel like the conversational ones work better when you have more time? Like, obviously, like maybe like a Joe Rogan or a Mark Maron, 2 to 3 hours to kind of get to the meat and of a conversation. And also like, because the first 15, 20 minutes is a bit of a getting to know you phase, unless you have a previous relationship with the guest. And I'm wondering if you think length of the podcast factors into that somehow.
I actually do think length factors to some extent, but it's not formula. It really depends on what the show needs and what that team needs. And so, I had this sort of joke at the end of the Digiday podcast of like, yeah, everything should be shorter. But
yeah, I remember.
But the reality is that like the show needs to be what it needs to be, right? So a 3 hour long interview can be really, really good, but it depends on the interviewer and the sort of substance of the interviewee. And it takes one kind of talent to be able to hold a full 3 hours. And anybody who's worked sports talk radio can tell you that it takes a specific kind of talent to hold 3 full hours versus something that could be an interesting, tight 10 to 20 minutes. So we just had Jody Avirgan on, who now does This Day in Esoteric Political History. And that is like, I think, a very, very well conceptualized, this is a discussion and this will max out at 15 to 20 minutes. And it's tight and it's smart and they know exactly the paces they need to hit. But it becomes it's less of an investigator in sort of exploratory search of the guest and more of a really intricate dance almost. Like they know what they're going to do. They're just going to have to sort of hit it in a way that feels interesting within the flow that they have. So yeah, I don't know. It depends, which is the most boring answer you can give, but it's true.
How you're about 9 in, and I don't know how many others you have in the can. Have you noticed any shift when you got started in how you're approaching the interviews and anything you're doing differently to engage more with your guests? I
think one thing that I really had to work on, and I'm still working on, not just within the context of the show, but in general, is that like I just needed more confidence going into it, because I think a really good conversation for us is where we get to the meat very, very quickly. And that requires a theory of the case from my part. Like I need when I'm preparing for any of these interviews, I need to have the theory of the case of the thing that we're talking about. And I really want to get to a point where the guest is comfortable talking about it.
Yeah.
But you also have to kind of leave room for things you didn't expect. And so, it's one thing for me to sort of understand that in theory. It's another thing to actually be in an interview with somebody that maybe you didn't really pre-interview, somebody that maybe I don't really know, and try to find an emotional place where we can feel like we can sort of like trade and play and open up with each other and really sort of like talk it through. I don't know. The way that I think about it is like, is that thing that people used to say about boxing, or they still do say about boxing, is that you have a plan and then they punch you in the face.
Until you get punched
and then you're like, wow, I forgot what the plan was.
How much of that is sort of, maybe it's improv skills? I think about it myself. I'm up to about 228 interviews so far, and I think the key points that I try to remember are to be naturally curious, to be comfortable with silence. Like, I love the video, and although I can't see your face right now, but just kind of when you ask someone a tough question, if they stop and they don't say anything, you're like, okay, are you still there? But it's just them thinking. They're just like, oh, that's interesting processing. And I think leaving room for that. And then the other thing I think about is, I always tell people the third person in the room is the listener as well. So just make sure that they're sort of like, it's almost like two people in a bar and they pulled up the third stool and they're just listening to us have a conversation.
I mean, yes and no, right? Like I'm perpetually fascinated by the sort of like friend in a bar conversation like metaphor, because I think it's one thing when it's you and your friend at a bar. It's another thing when you're listening to two friends at a bar that you don't know.
Yeah.
No, so I think the rubric's a little different for me, because we sort of aggressively edit the interviews. By we, I think mostly my sort of producer, the team that I work with, I don't like saying my producers, my collaborators.
Yeah.
They're really judicious with cutting, and so it actually has this effect where it kind of takes a lot of the burden off my back to really get to the meat really quickly, because different guests have different kind of comfort levels, right? I had the privilege of, like, with each of the actual interview when I'm conducting it, that we can take our time. We can take our time. We can work on this. We can work on that. And we try to find places you're comfortable with. Then we find what I'm interested in, on top of what I brought into the interview. And then at the end of the day, you have raw tape, and then you guys kind of, play around with the chunks and try to find out what the representative portions are. So I think it's a little bit different when it comes to, a show like this, where the entire arc, actually, most of it will go in. And so the beginning has to feel like it's contiguous to what comes after that. It has to feel contiguous to what comes after that. And it has to end in a way, and it has to land in a way that feels like it's a closure. Because there are a bunch of interview shows that you can just pick up, it just ends. And that is like one of the worst feelings, is to sort of like, oh really? That's over? I've watched many television shows do that. And so I don't know, it's a bit of a different format for sure.
How much time goes into each episode?
Like how much time of work in general?
Yeah, total production time between, obviously, I mean, once it's recorded and then it's in the production team's hands. How many hours would you guess goes into each episode?
A couple of hours. I can't speak for, because we handle different parts of it. Like I work on the scripting, and then I do the tracking. Well, actually, my collaborative team, they come up with a very, very rough draft of what the tracking could be, and then I rewrite it. But then I also listen through to the tracks. So like, I think for me personally, I spend, outside of the interview itself, 2 hours of prep maybe, and like maybe 4 or 5 hours of just like going through and thinking about it, and then like also writing and just having an opinion about it, because I need to go out and like do radio spots on it and promote it and talk about it and think about it, that kind of thing. So, but I'm pretty sure my collaborative team, that they have a different answer for you there, and they're also like juggling a bunch of different projects, and so maybe it differs from week to week. But we typically try to we're trying to beat the clock here and be 2 weeks ahead at a time.
How much of your personality comes through on these interviews? Are you conscious of that, of, imposing your views, or are you trying to be a neutral medium and have the conversation be representative of more of the guest personality?
That's actually an interesting way to frame the question. I kind of feel like, again, it depends, but my hope with each individual episode is that my personality only exists to the extent of the framing, and that the point of each episode is like to really kind of get that person through. And so if it becomes more me kind of talking about what I think and my views, we failed. We fundamentally failed. Like I am the constant factor. So people, hopefully if they stick around, so week over week, they will know me over time. I don't need to pose upon myself.
Yeah.
But they only get that one person for that moment. Maybe they'll follow up by subscribing to that person's show, but they only get that person at one glimpse. And so like it's a disservice to them if I'm more than, 30% of the actual interview.
You still uncomfortable with the term intimate medium?
It's not uncomfortable. It's just that I think it's lost all its meaning when people keep talking about it. Like, it's true,
yeah.
But I think people, when they say it now, they don't they don't respect the word. I'm about respecting the word.
Yeah. A couple of questions as we wrap up. What's something you've changed your mind about recently?
I'm trying to figure out what I want to give you, a trivial or non-trivial answer. Which would you prefer?
The non-trivial.
The non-trivial one. I really changed my mind on protests, actually. I'm actually very much, I used to sort of think about it as from, I think my experience formatively when I was sort of in the United States was the Occupy movement. And I kind of watched that move from something that initially felt meaningful to something that felt, exclusive. Like you need to be a certain kind of person to engage in that kind of type of protest. But I think I had sort of really reframed my thinking as to like, there is that version of protest, but then there are all these other kinds of protests that you really need to sort of like find a way to relate to and be a part of. And then you have to sort of understand that there's sort of like there are coalitions being built here, and there are different kinds of factions and different kinds of identities and communities that are part of what feels like a singular action. And so that was something that I only very roughly understood before this moment, but keeping a closer eye and doing a ton of reading and just sort of like, talking to people who are parts of, who are mobilizing in their states, just having a better understanding of that has been a really, really it's been a big thing for me to process past couple of weeks.
Yeah, we took part in a march here in Minneapolis, and then there's something about the energy of actually marching down the streets, just, shouting out no justice, no peace, and prosecute the police, and there's a interesting dynamic that happens in groups like that. So it's and especially in light of this being ground zero for where all it started, it's been pretty fascinating to watch and take part in.
Yeah, and also just thinking about the real sort of political purpose, right? Like, what are the outcomes that we want from these remarkable sort of shows of solidarity or shows of political expression? What comes next is something that like I'm really, really, really just sort of have a tremendous amount of like emotion and energy about. I come from a country that like, we had our shot. We had a shot at something better, and then the process has stalled. It feels like, I used to be a lot more skeptical about the kinds of people who do gravitate towards like longer term protests, but now I've completely felt more empathetic towards that movement.
Interesting. What's the most misunderstood thing about you?
That I'm not American. There's a lot of people who take it for granted that like that I am actually very foreign. I might be up on all my references and that I can connect and relate to Americans really easily, but my internal life is very, very foreign.
Interesting. Well, Nick, I really enjoyed our conversation. I appreciate you coming on and taking the time. A lot more questions to ask. And obviously, when it's a show about podcasting and you're talking to the editor of a podcast newsletter, there's a lot more things to cover. But I definitely appreciate you sharing a bit of your story with our audience.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
What's the best place for folks to connect with you online?
Well, first of all, listen to the show, Servative Pod. It's exactly like how it sounds. It comes out every Wednesday. And then if you want to find the newsletter, go to hotpotnews.com.
All right. Thanks again, Nick. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
So thanks again to Nick for such an engaging and insightful conversation. So inspiring, especially when you think about him starting the newsletter in 2014, when I started Podcast Junkies, and we were on different paths, but supporting the same cause. And 6 years later, ended up at the same place. So it's funny how the world works. Check out full show notes at podcastjunkies.com/231. Intro and outro music composed by Cedar and Soil. Check out his fantastic music at cedarsoil.com. And don't forget to check out our sponsor, Focusrite, and their awesome line of gear, specifically the Scarlett 2i2. Head on over to podcastjunkies.com/Focusrite to see the full line. Tune in next week for my conversation with Tyler Martin. Tyler actually reached out to me, and after a bit of back and forth, we were able to make the conversation happen. He is the host of Have It Blessed Gay, and we talk about the worlds of religion and spirituality and sexual identity all merging and coming together in what is his show. And it was a really fun and personal conversation at parts. And I really enjoyed it. And I think it's something a little bit different. And I think you'll really get a feel for the sincerity of Tyler and what he's doing with the show. If you want your review read out loud, as Stephanie's was at the beginning of the show, head on over to ratethispodcast.com/podcastjunkies. Yes, you. I'm talking to you. The moment I read out that URL, you were thinking to yourself, I've been meaning to write Harry a review. I've been listening to the show for so long, and I feel like I should. Well, I'm here to tell you, today's the day. ratethispodcast.com/podcastjunkies. Okay, you made it this far. No doubt you're waiting for the retention hashtag. Let's go with Hot Pod Nick. Hot Pod Nick. Thanks again for all you do to support the show. I love you.